That was too kind. Thank you, Peter. So, good morning. Again, my name is Chuck Duginski. For those I haven't met, quick show of hands. How many attendees were here last year? I know there are quite a few familiar faces. Oh, not as bad as I thought. Okay, good, because I'm going to give the same talk I gave last year. With some updates and revisions. I'll probably get off script a little bit more this year. What I'm going to provide this morning is my own perspective on giving, how that has developed over time, and highlighting hopefully some generalizations, some lessons that can be drawn from that experience. I don't speak for all donors. This is not the Jeremy. Is Jeremy Beer here back today? Well, I was going to say after watching his talk on the psychology of giving, I was going to rename mine from a donor's perspective to the psychology of giving, a rebuttal. There are a lot of things he said that I agree with, but I do have some different perspectives. Listening to the speakers yesterday, what I learned about being a development professional, which I'm not. You got to go find pools of money that are just sitting out there somewhere. There's all this wealth that is just unlocked, and we call that capacity. Then we have to either identify links to those pools of capital, and we call that propensity. And then you have to speak to an elephant, and I'm not sure I don't know where my elephant resides if you want to talk to him. But somehow then if you do those things and tell them a punchy story, you just ring the cash register and money comes out. There's a lot missing in that. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. I describe my role here at this conference so that it's not just a bunch of fundraisers talking to each other about fundraising. So that's hopefully the value that I bring. And the question I want to start with, because the thing that I think is missing from that model that I just that cartoonish model that I just was ridiculing, what's missing in there is, how do you find, and more importantly, how do you develop a giving heart? That was the one thing that was missing in all of that. That somehow if you've got a link to the mission or the organization and have money, you're going to want to give it away. But it doesn't work that way. That's got to be developed over time. And I want everyone to ask yourselves that when you're working with donors, how are you helping them develop a giving heart? Particularly for those of you, it's a particular challenge that I'm issuing to those that are in diocesan roles at the archdiocese or diocesan level, or if you're at Catholic Charities for the diocese, or you're at the Catholic Foundation for the diocese, because that is the mission of your organization, spiritual development of the faithful. And if you're not thinking about that, and you're not thinking how you participate in helping people develop spiritually, then you're not connected to the mission. Then you're just raising money, and what's the point of that? So that is a challenge I am issuing to you, and that's really what I'm here to talk about: developing that giving heart, and how does that happen? So I can only speak about my own experience. I'm not a psychologist. I haven't done sociological studies, but I'm going to talk to you about how that has happened for me, how I have experienced that spiritual development over time. So first, a little bit of background. You got some of it in my conversation with John. Lifelong Catholic. My family's roots are in Western Minnesota. Dad really did lose the house when I was about 9 years old, and that prompted a move to Phoenix as they were trying to rebuild their life. So I grew up about 5 miles from here. My mom still lives in the house that I grew up in. I'm staying with her this week. But it's a humble background with that financial background from my parents, and I am the youngest of 6 kids. Every answer I gave John was an honest one. I did have to fund my own education. It was really a rebuilding story. I talked about my arrival in Oklahoma, meeting my wife of 30 years there as a student. And I've done, as indicated by John, I've done pretty well in the oil and gas industry since I graduated college. My volunteer activity and my involvement, again, you heard some of that in my bio and with John, really centered on building up the church in Oklahoma City, focus on Catholic education. I actually met Peter singing in the choir at our parish. I sing baritone, still do. I've been in the parish choir for almost 20 years. and then various building and fundraising committees at the parish there. So that gives you a little insight, and John was asking the right questions. Those are where our passions lie. Very centered on home. That's where we feel responsible. The Catholic community in Oklahoma is still fairly small in terms of a percentage of the population, and we're a young state. We've only been a state for a little over 100 years. Oklahoma City and Tulsa, the centers of population 100 years ago, were small towns. And so we're building up the institutional church in Oklahoma, and that's where our passion is and where our focus is, both in terms of the physical infrastructure as well as the Catholic culture in Oklahoma. That's where my heart is. So back to the talk and back to kind of that spiritual development. What I'm going to talk about today is that spiritual growth, spiritual progress, spiritual conversion as a model for how we have entered more deeply into Catholic philanthropy and giving. So conversion, what do I mean by that? My experience of Catholic philanthropy has run in parallel with my development spiritually as a Catholic. And there again, that's the opportunity and responsibility, I believe, for your vocation as development professionals and fundraisers, taking the opportunity to take your donors and your contacts, deeper into relationship with Christ. And part of that, as I'll talk about, is Catholic philanthropy. So just to set the stage, let's talk a little bit about the conversion experience. And again, I'm going to talk about my own over time. My personal experience of conversion has been a stepwise progression into my faith. It didn't happen all at once. I wasn't St. Paul on the road to Damascus, knocked off my horse, and all of a sudden, here we go. It's been more of a stepwise progression. So as a basic example, as I was telling John, there was a time as a Catholic that I wasn't too fussy about getting to Mass every week on Sunday. As I described, Robyn and I were dating. We started going to Mass more frequently. My faith always had that intellectual assent, but I wasn't necessarily practicing it and doing the things that I needed to do. I hadn't had that conversion of will. I had intellectual assent, but my will had not engaged to get me to Mass every week, until it did. Until the process of getting into the further relationship with my wife. It was a small step, but a step conversion. I went from being a person that didn't necessarily go to Mass every Sunday to the person that did, and that conversion, was just the first step on that journey. Then I was a person. We were young people. We hadn't bought a home yet. We were moving around. We'd find a Mass to go to on the weekend. We'd get to Mass, but we didn't have a parish home yet. We were doing the minimum, but at some point, we got to the point where rather than just, going to Mass or just joining the parish and being there in the pew every Sunday, at some point, the conversion happened where I went from being a consumer in the pew to a contributor at the parish, and contributing financially at first, and then, with my weekly envelope back then, 30 years ago, but eventually, okay, well, wait a minute, I can get involved. I can start giving back. So I went from being a person that was consuming Mass on Sunday to somebody that was giving back. And I was a different person. Before I was this person, after that next small step in my conversion, I became that person that was getting more engaged. And then eventually, started to speak up and share my faith, and not just receiving, not just checking the box that we made it to Mass, but talking about my faith, expressing my faith, developing my own understanding of my personal faith so I could convey it to others. So conversion. Years later, not too long ago, I made a further commitment to make an effort to go to Mass every day. And I do pretty well. I'm not perfect, but I went from being the guy that was religious about going to Mass on Sunday to the guy that was making the effort to move into a deeper relationship with Christ in the Eucharist by going to daily Mass and doing that on a regular basis. So once again, I used to be this guy, now I'm that guy. And it's a work in progress, of course, but that's where I am on the road, going through my spiritual development, getting into a deeper relationship with Christ. I like to tell the story about that. If I don't tell the story, Peter will make me, because it was a mutual friend. Peter had invited me to join him at a conference as an attendee, and introduced me to a friend of his who was a notable and vocal attendee of daily masses. Also a guy, CEO of a company at least as busy as I am. And I said to him, man, my dad was a daily mass goer. I've always aspired to that. You're at least as busy as I am. How do you make it work? How do you get to mass every day? And he looked at me like he was confused by the question, and his response was, well, I make it a priority. And it killed me. I mean, it was like he stabbed me in the heart. I was like, I guess if I really want to do that, I better make it a priority too. So again, that's how that moment of conversion, in that moment, I went from being this guy to that guy. And that stepwise conversion, stepping closer and closer and further into relationship with Christ. Those are the conversion, that's the conversion model that I'm talking about. So in each case, we've got an intellectual assent. This is something that I understand, that I want to do, that I want to attach to, that I want to move towards. There's an act of will associated with that I'm moving closer. The other thing is what I just mentioned, though, that there's actually a role model involved as well, an example, somebody that I want to emulate, somebody that shows me that it can be done. So certainly the intellectual assent and the act of will are necessary and sufficient, if you want to put it in those terms. But really the facilitating influence is having somebody that I can look at and say, if he can do it, I can do it. And that's part of it too. And that's going to come up when we talk about giving as well. So, if you want to go back to Jeremy's talk, these conversion moments, is my identity changing, and that's leading me to different membership affinities? Maybe. But that's not what the personal experience is. That's me changing and growing as a disciple of Christ. All right, so back to giving. We're going to use that conversion model of intellect and will and example, but talk a little bit, talk about in the context of philanthropy. So I refer to this first part of my talk as going from 0 to 1. How do we go from not doing any giving to giving something? Obviously, there's got to be a desire, the intellectual desire to do that. Fortunately, that becomes pretty easy in American culture. There's and particularly in Christian culture, because there is an expectation that's built in culturally that there's some giving back. It's built into our tax code that giving is deductible. That's a good indication that society wants us to give. In a Christian context, of course, there's all the biblical quotes. God loves a cheerful giver. When you give, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, etc. Jesus says there, when you give, there's an expectation that's being set for a disciple of Christ that there's some giving back. So some level of giving, it's very easily facilitated in America and in Christian culture. Hopefully, most of us have a good foundation of role models. I talked about my father as a role model when I was growing up. So we see it all around it. This is kind of what we do. We do some degree of giving. Hopefully you've got stewardship talks and catechesis going on in your communities, parish communities, your donor communities. Talking about why giving is important. It doesn't just happen, even at a rudimentary level, but it certainly doesn't happen when you start talking about broader and more meaningful giving and philanthropy. So there's got to be some teaching, some catechesis, and also role models. Doesn't just have to happen in the Catholic setting. I mentioned the United Way. We've got a great United Way organization in Oklahoma. I lead a company of about 100 people. I try to develop them professionally. I try to develop them as people. Part of that is, because this is so important to me as I'm talking about it today, part of that is teaching my employees, trying to develop them as well-rounded individuals, not just corporate cogs, that they need to give back. And you can say what you want about the United Way, but that's a way for me to give in a secular sense. I can stand up in front of my company and say, I'm making a pledge to the United Way, and I would like you to do the same. I can't do that with, I don't teach, or I don't lead a company of Catholics. So that's more that's more impactful than saying, hey, let's all give to Catholic charities. Well, or give to my parish. Why would they do that? But we can, even in a secular sense, I'm trying to teach people around me that I'm responsible for, that giving back is part of it, and that United Way is a way to do that. So I think in the rudimentary sense of giving, I describe it as transactional. I don't necessarily mean that as a pejorative. There's nothing wrong with transactional giving. People are giving, and that's a good thing. But it is the earliest stage. But what does that look like? Hey, when I happen to be at Mass, I'm going to throw a couple bucks in the basket when it comes around. That consumer mindset. By the way, I don't mean that as a negative. When I'm at a church on vacation, when I'm away from home, guess what I do? When the basket comes around, I throw some money in there, because they're serving me as a traveling Catholic that needs to go to Mass. There's nothing wrong with that. For your work and your ministries, that may be okay. I bought a ticket to the gala. I'm going to take my wife out for a nice evening, and we're going to spend it at the Catholic Charities Gala, or whatever event. Maybe I'm looking for a good deal. Maybe I can get a steal at the auction, but I'm getting something back in return for that support that I'm giving. In another sense, I give to the University of Oklahoma because by doing that, I get good seats at the football game. That's a transaction. Sometimes it's not a small gift. To Jeremy's point yesterday, this is where we get into the rebuttal, or one of the ways we get into the rebuttal. He was talking about his donor that talks about return on investment, but keeps giving gifts to his alma mater where he gets no return on investment. Well, maybe he doesn't. Maybe we just can't see what that return on investment is. Maybe it's a non-economic return. Maybe he wants to get his granddaughter into favorable treatment by the admissions office. I think there's always a return on investment, and it's not unimportant. So an example in this sense, and a creative example, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a transaction in the moment or economic. It can be retroactive. When I'd been out of college for about 10 years, going back to the OU example, there was a development officer that I had a previous relationship with, and he said, "Okay, Chuck, we need to go get coffee. You're 10 years out of college. You started to build your career. You're doing well. It's time to give back." I went to Oklahoma on a free ride. I do feel an obligation to give back, but it's not a deep relationship. It's transactional. It's retroactively paying for what I received from the university. It's still transactional. Again, it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean small money, but it's not a very deep relationship, and that's the downside of that transactional giving. If another priority comes up, that's the charity that gets axed, and I move on to something that I'm more deeply connected with. So I do think with that, it's even in transactional mode, it's important to build community. That's a lot of the galas and the events and that sort of thing. That friend raising, I think, is a term that I've heard used before. Building those relationships, because that's what sets the foundation for the next step. There are barriers to moving forward, though, and that's that next step at conversion. What keeps donors from getting to that next step? A lot of the time, it's just not understanding the finances of the organization. Hey, we've got a parish of 1,200 families. If everyone just gave what I'm giving, the parish would have all the money that it needs. Or if ever, at whatever level, hey, I'm given X dollars a week. If everyone did that, the parish would be fine financially, and that's true. But you all know that that's not what happens. But drawing those donors in to a little bit more realistic view of the parish finances, continuing with that example, this is how it gets funded. This is the distribution of our donors. You're here, we need a certain number of people to step up and be at the higher tier because not everybody can. or not everybody is willing to. That gets back to the question with John, why do you need, for me, Robyn and Chuck Duginski to write this check? That's part of it. It's that education. Well, because a lot of people don't, and you've got the capacity to, and if you want, you've got an obligation. These are the realities of the financial situation, and we need people that are going to pay more than their fair share because we've got free riders who are just not doing their part. So drawing donors, drawing benefactors deeper into the realities and the decision making of the organization is a way that you can pull them in, help them move and move from one level of giving, one mode of giving, transactional in this case, into a deeper mode that's more supportive and more enduring. But ultimately, there needs to be that paradigm shift, that conversion from, okay, I'm doing my part and everyone else should, to I want this organization to succeed and therefore I do more because not everybody else will. I do want to point out, as we start talking about the next part of my talk, which is first part was going from 0 to 1. The next part is going from 1 to 10. I want to point out that this is not a new problem. 1600 years ago, St. Augustine wrote in a commentary on the Gospel of Luke. This is where they're talking about the Pharisees tithing, the mint from their garden. They're so scrupulous about giving their tithe. He's explaining to his congregation in Hippo what tithing is, and he explains the Jews withdrew 1/10 of their produce and gave it in alms, which a Christian rarely does. So 16 years ago, St. Augustine was trying to explain to Christians about tithing, and clearly they weren't getting it. But it's important. So when I talk about moving from 1 to 10, there's the giveaway. I'm talking about how do you get people to a level of tithing, and it's important, not just for our organizations, but for our donors in their spiritual journey. The precepts of the church simply say that we as the faithful are supposed to give to provide for the material needs of the church. I think that's way off base. I know that's the presumptuous thing to say about the catechism or the precepts of the church, but I think it's got it entirely wrong. In my experience, our conversion to tithing was one of the most significant steps on our spiritual journey. Our conversion to tithing was one of the most significant steps in my spiritual journey. The core of that experience, of that conversion into somebody who didn't tithe and thought we were doing fine, we were being supportive, but then converting to a person and a family that committed ourselves to tithing. What was that all about? The core of that conversion, and this is where you can help your donors and help the faithful in your diocese. The core of that conversion was me realizing that God doesn't need my money. God doesn't need anything. He certainly doesn't need my money. So why was it so important for God to tell the Jews in the Old Testament that tithing was required? It wasn't for him. He didn't need it. He knows that we need to let go of our material things. And that's what tithing is for me. It changes my relationship with money. It moves me out of the money acquisition game that is endemic to our society, and it moves me into the stewardship game, because the first fruits, the first 10% move right in and right out the door. And that is a different relationship with money, and it's a necessary one on the spiritual journey. We've got to be able to detach ourselves from this world, and step one is getting detached from the money game. You can help your donors, you can help your benefactors, you can help the people in your parish understand that. It's something we don't teach. It's lacking in the catechism, both capital C catechism and the lowercase catechism that goes on every day. We've got to teach more about that. So please take that message back. Go back and push that. It can't be coming from Father at the pulpit on Sunday. The tithing message from Father on Sunday, I'm sure Father Jim will agree with me, it doesn't have credibility. It's got to come from folks that are representative. You need that role model in your parish who will stand up and say, here's why we tithe, here's what it does for me personally, here's what it does for my family, here's what it doesn't do. We don't feel like we're missing 10% of everything that happens. I mean, it doesn't work that way. You don't notice the difference. Just like if you get a 10% raise at work, within 3 months, you forget that you got a 10% raise. It works the same in the other direction. You take 10% off the top, you don't feel it in your lifestyle within a few months. So with that, it takes me out of the acquisition game. Like I said, I'm not worried about getting a good deal. I'm not worried about what I get in return for that gift. I don't need to go to the auction to get a good deal. I just want to be supportive of the organization because that's part of my stewardship. And we gotta move people there. And also, by the way, that different relationship with money, it takes me out of the comparison game. Because even when I'm talking to other CEOs and they're talking about their second house and where they took their vacation, in the back of my mind, that's fine. I'm doing something else with my money that is more meaningful to me than that experience or that asset or whatever that they've accumulated. So there's a book recently by Ephraim Radner, and he had a quote that speaks to that. He says in that book, he says, "One cannot be a slave to what one offers up. Therefore, not a slave to money." So God offers us freedom if we orient our lives to Him. That it's freedom and that deeper relationship with Christ that comes from that step, and also a sense of trust that God's going to provide for us. That's how important this message is, and that's where I think the catechism is lacking, and that's where I think your role is unique, especially lay people in the room. Your role is unique in helping your donors take that spiritual step, and we can't just not talk about it. And there are cultural elements with that and scriptural elements. Don't let people know what you're giving away. An anonymous gift is the most virtuous gift and all that. But that misses that opportunity to spread this aspect of the gospel message with the people around us. So I think we have to talk about it. I think it's got to be lay people. The most effective stewardship talk I ever experienced, but prior to my conversion to tithing, was hearing a guy with 9 kids talk about how his family tithes and how important it was to him. Again, that's where father doesn't have the credibility, but a guy trying to support a family of 11 certainly does. So I leave you with that, and I urge you to take that back to your work. And there's a lot of questions that people have. Where does this idea come from? Is it still required? Is it not required? How much do I give to the church? How much do I give to other organizations? Is this pre-tax income or post-tax income? What about my family? I mean, all these are questions that people are going to have, and we've got to have a ready response in order to help them with that growth. And again, having those role models in place is a key part of that. As you're talking to people, giving them, helping develop some guidelines, or urge others to as well. We had heard 5% to the parish and 2.5% to the diocese and 2.5% for whatever else, and that all works. But the main thing is to get people start along that journey, even if it's, as somebody suggested yesterday, start with 1 or 2%, try to up that to 3 or 4, just like retirement planning. Everyone struggles with that when they're going, but you've got to make that conversion as well. Okay. Enough on that. So, as people are tithing, as they're allocating their gifts, now we're at the next stage of giving. It's not just transactional anymore. It's steady, it's intentional, it's thoughtful. When I was talking to John, okay, hey, we're going to give, we've got an amount that we give to the parish every year. We've got an amount that we give to Catholic Charities, that we've got an amount that we give to the Archbishop's Appeal. It's in the budget. It's the first item in our budget. It's conducive to auto pay. So it's steady income. This is why you want to get your donors there. What comes out of that spiritually, though, is there's a sense of ownership that as I'm thinking in terms of home ownership versus renting your home. When you're renting your home, you're living in somebody else's house. You're paying your rent every month. You're enjoying the benefits of shelter. but it's a different relationship with your shelter when you own the home. We need to build this up. We need to make improvements. We need to continue to grow. What needs to be fixed? What needs to be prepared? What needs to be repaired? In my experience, going from giving and the transactional mode into more of a tithing supportive role at the parish, we became owners of the parish. In my view, that's why, as Peter was saying, we're on every committee. We need to build this institution up. We need to maintain what we've got. How do we grow? That's the spiritual benefit of that. It's not just about the money. It takes us into a deeper relationship with the organization that we're giving to, and I'm sure each of you can imagine how that applies to your own ministries and efforts. From Matthew, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The other aspect of that ownership, though, is there's a demand for transparency and visibility into what's going on with the money. We give, as I was describing, we give chunky gifts through the year. When the bonus comes in, we write a check. In the case of our parish support, I know that I'm knowledgeable enough to know that receipts go down in the summertime. So at least before all the automatic deduction stuff got started. So we made a decision that if we're going to make a lump sum gift, we're going to do it in July at the beginning of the fiscal year. Because we know that's when giving drops. We're going to try to fill that gap a little bit by the way we structure our giving. In the case of our parish, they put the parish receipts, the offertory in the bulletin every week. So I wrote a check that was big enough to be noticeable in the offertory, and it didn't show up, and that was a problem. Where'd that money go? I just wrote a lumpy check, and clearly it's not included in these numbers. A small thing, but there was obviously a lack of visibility into where the money was going, and because of that prompted me to getting financial reports from the finance committee, and I get them every month to this day after 15 years after that experience, because they know I need to see where the money's going. And that's because I'm an owner, because I'm an investor in that parish, literally and figuratively. There was nothing nefarious going on, just to finish that up. There was a misguided objective. They didn't want people to think that we were too far ahead on our collections, so they didn't put they didn't include that in the reported numbers. Well, that's misguided and not very trusting of the parish. But these are the things. Again, take whatever lesson you can from that for your own organization. That there's got to be visibility and transparency for folks that are making gifts that are large enough to move the needle. They need to see that. They want to see it. They need honest reporting back, and they need to understand that you're being good stewards of that money. That requires some access and relationship with your leaderships. For your major supporting donors, they need to know your CFO. They need to know your executive director. They need to be comfortable picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, what's going on in the organization?" Again, on the flip side, there are real spiritual benefits that your donors will experience as they move into this mode. Material detachment, I talked about that, spiritual growth, and also a degree of self-mastery, that I've got my relationship with money. I'm now in control of my relationship with money, not letting that relationship control me. The downside, the hazard, is there can be a sense of self-satisfaction. Not everybody's tithing, but I am. I'm doing everything God asked me to do. Isn't that great? Aren't I great? So there's some hazard there, but the challenge there also is that the Old Testament was the tithing was the Old Testament requirement. Jesus calls us to do more than that. So the next part of my talk is entitled, pushing from 10 tithing, pushing from 10 to 100, because Christ asks us to give everything away, challenges us to. Matthew, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. So I'm not there yet. I have not given away all my worldly possessions. So there's only so much I can describe about that, but I am continuing to progress along that journey, and I'll share what I can. So here we are, we're doing everything we can. We're kind of smugly tithing and feeling pretty good about ourselves. We've got our plan for the year, X to the parish, X to the diocese. Okay, we got a little bit more money. Here's where that's going to go. And then we get the call that the capital campaign is starting. And we want you to make a sacrificial gift over the next 5 years. And that's a gut check for somebody who's already giving at a pretty healthy level of their income. They're already tithing, and now you're calling and asking for a major gift. If you've got the strong relationships in place, they may be prepared for that call. They may be open to that call, but it's difficult. Now we're really talking about sacrificial gifts too. It's, well, gee, I was going to upgrade the car next year, but maybe we put that off because the capital campaign has started. You've got to have, you can help people through that, but you've got to have a solid relationship before that comes. And that's the reason to be with people along that spiritual journey that got them there. Role models and examples continue to be important here. Having lead givers, hopefully relationships among your donor base. If you're that sort of organization, I know national organizations with dispersed donor bases, that can be hard to do. I get that. I think that's where some of the communities that were talked about, creating communities for your donors, provides them with those role models. Whether it's, I'm not a pickleball player, but I'm looking at the pickleball coach over there. But that may just be leadership giving societies, hopefully receptions and that sort of thing. Get your donors to know each other for that reason, because they need role models to show that there's a reason and an ability to do more than just the base level. Giving in this mode is strategic giving. The rewards for donors are accomplishment and influence. But now we're really getting into investment mode. This isn't just if on the renter to homeownership level. This is going into investment mode, and it's definitely, this is where I would push back on Jeremy on your donors wanting to see a return on investment. If your donors have accumulated wealth, they've likely done it in a business setting. I can't speak to people who inherited wealth because I don't know what inheriting wealth is like. Sounds great, but that's not what I know about. But if your donors, your benefactors have accumulated wealth through their own efforts or their own investments, they will think about things in a business mode. To take it out of money for a second, I'm an engineer by degree. My degree is in mechanical engineering. I have taught myself how to think of it as an engineer and imprinted that. And I've been very successful, so it's been reinforced. I cannot stop thinking about optimizing processes and efficiencies. I can't drive from one part of town to the other without thinking about, and I can't make the drive without thinking about, was there a better route I could have taken? I wish I could turn it off, and my wife certainly wishes I could turn it off. But that is the mode that I've learned to think in, and I think about everything that way because that's how I've trained myself. A business professional, someone who has succeeded in business and made investments and sent their money out. I love the Shark Tank line from Kevin O'Leary. When I send my money out, I expect it to make friends and bring more back with it. That's how people accumulate wealth, and they're going to think about their charitable giving the same way, because that's how they've trained themselves to think about money as a tool to go out into the world and get things done, and what is it bringing back to me? So, contra Jeremy, return on investment matters, and accountability matters, and transparency matters, back to the point on the previous point. I need to know what my money is doing while it's out there, what work is my money getting done, and what am I going to get back in return. So in this point, this is an update from last year. So last year, Fran Meyer published a book called True Confessions. Is anyone familiar with that? Raise a show of hands. I see Father, just Father. Okay. So True Confessions, it looks like this. Fran Meyer, it's Ignatius Press, like all good books are. That was not fair. If our publisher is still here, forgive me. But True Confessions, Voices of Faith from a Life in the Church, and he's got anonymous interviews with American bishops, charitable leaders, leaders of lay apostolate. So for anyone working in Catholic circles in 2024, 2025, I heavily recommend this book. And specifically, one of the chapters is chapter 8. It's called The Investors. And this is interviews with major benefactors that are funding new organizations, trying to make things happen in the church, really more like venture capitalists than just somebody investing in a stock. They're trying to make things happen with their money, and they think about things like you would a venture capital startup. How can I leverage my money? What is the risk reward? How likely is this apostolate to work? Can I trust the founder of this apostolate, just like you would, a business you're investing? Can I trust him with my money to do the things that he says he's going to do? Some of these people are entrepreneurial folks, just like business starters. We see something that we want to get done in the church. Let's go raise money and go do it and go attack the problem. Can that person mature? Take that entrepreneurial instinct and mature that into a steady, ongoing apostolate that's going to reap benefits for the future. The Focus guys in there, and Curtis Martin, great example. I mean, admire him as an entrepreneur just from a business perspective, but the hardest thing about that is making the transition to a lasting institution, and having watched some of that, that's a great example of that. So I recommend that. It helps give some insight into donors giving at that sort of level, particularly for startup type efforts. There may be a different, just like investing in a corporation, there's going to be a different level of expectation for established entities. Okay, I know Catholic Charities, they've been operating in Oklahoma City for how long? 112 years. So the 112-year organization, I know the management, I see them around town. I can pick up the phone and call the executive director. I don't need a whole lot of due diligence on Catholic Charities. But if it's I'll give another example. I'm way off script and going in different order here, but we had a new ministry come into Oklahoma City and called Vagabond Ministries. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the Vagabond guys wanted to open it. They minister to inner city youth, low income youth, just on a personal level, and that's an entry to draw them into a conversation about Catholic school and learning more about Catholicism and their faith. I think it's great. It was something, what I said earlier, building up the church in Oklahoma City, I thought it would be a really cool thing for Oklahoma City to have. I needed to do some diligence. I did make a gift. But one thing about that gift, I made it clear, this is seed money. This is not a mission that I'm particularly connected with. They want donors to go hang out with the kids and play basketball, and that's not what I'm going to do. But I thought it would be a cool thing for the city. So, hey guys, had the conversation with Joe, asked for a recurring, sustaining gift. I said, look, I'm not going to do that, but I want you to succeed. I think this is a cool thing. Here's a seed money gift. This will buy you, some time for year one to go find the donors that do connect to your mission, because I know they're out there, but don't, this is what you're getting from me. We're not going to be the sustaining gift. He's asked for one since then, and I gave him the same answer, but he has found a broader base of support. So risk reward, I'm thinking, okay, can I do some diligence? I had some questions. They've grown really fast because it's sustainable. It looks like it can succeed. It looks like these are guys that I can trust with some money. But I wanted them to get started, but I didn't want to be the sustaining gift. And ultimately Joe's okay with that. And I think they're up and running now. But it's a good example of kind of a different mode of giving from what I've described previously, because there was something that I wanted to get done, a little bit more of that venture capital mode. Like, okay, I want you guys to get kicked off and get started. So, be respectful if those are the gifts that your donors want to make. Let's see, what else? So we've talked a lot. How are we doing on time? Got a little time. We talked about kind of intellectual assent and the act of will. We talked about the importance of role models and your role in facilitating that. We talked about various modes of giving, kind of the transactional mode, the very intentional tithing level mode, and then strategic investment type giving. We talked about the self-image that accompanies these and some of the barriers to getting from one level to another. But again, I want you to take the message back. You've got a role and a role as spiritual guides to your donors and benefactors, should you choose to accept it, to help them with their growth and drawing them into your mission. I think that's another aspect that I got off script and may have gotten around it. Well, I'll come back to that. Let's see. We talked about spiritual benefits that come from higher modes of giving, and your role. Now, again, I see that there's room for growth in the room here, because a lot of when I was here last year and then again yesterday, am I manipulating people? Well, no, you're not manipulating people. You're helping them grow. And so if you approach your donors with that mindset, you don't have to worry about about your own motives. You're trying to help them find ways to become better people, and they will get benefits out of that. If you don't have that mindset, then you should check your motives. I'm not saying just take their money and it'll make them better people. That's not it. But the fact is, this is an opportunity to facilitate spiritual growth, particularly around kind of material detachment, and develop the sense of our role as stewards of all the gifts that come from God. And you guys have a ministry to do in that regard, and I hope you accept it, because that takes you just away from the mechanical, simplistic model that were described yesterday. You can help your folks grow. You can bring them along on the mission with you. And that takes me to my final thought. So I was 6 or 7 years old. I just, based on things going on around it gets down to a very, very narrow window of my childhood when this could be. It was back in western Minnesota. And a missionary priest came to the parish. He was making his parish visits to preach and raise money. And after talking about his ministry, at the end of his talk, he said something that really hit me as a child, and enough that I carry it with me today. I imagine this was a Maryknoll father, somebody who was going to the jungles and spreading the gospel, which caught my imagination. But what he said at the end of his talk, he said, some people give by going, and some people go by giving. So he was the missionary. He was the guy that was giving to the kingdom of God by going out to those people, but inviting the rest of us to go with him with our dollars. So some people give by going, some people go by giving. And I hope you remember that. And I hope that you remember that your donors and benefactors are integral parts to your ministries and should see themselves that way. One of the things I didn't say about tithing, but I'll come back to it here. The act of tithing is what sanctifies my work running an oil and gas company. Because I know that, that the first fruits of everything I do, every dollar I earn, the first fruits are going back to build up the kingdom of God. That makes every day of my life an act of charity. That's part of the spiritual benefit that comes out of tithing. Forgive me for glossing over that. But I come back to it now because that means that every dollar I make running an oil and gas company, when I'm giving it to ministries that are important to me, that makes my work holy. It doesn't sound like running an oil and gas company is holy work, but tithing is the link that sanctifies my work every single day. And that's what you've got the opportunity to offer to your benefactors, an understanding of that. So they are working with their dollars. They are working right beside you in your ministry. They should understand that that's where they are. They are with you every day in your ministry by the fact that they are helping to fund it. And whatever they do, however they're earning their living, that is holy work because it is funding holy work. And that's a link that, again, we can help people understand. Whether they're sitting behind a desk or whatever they're doing, they have an opportunity in that work to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, console the prisoner, and protect the vulnerable. So Please take that. I've got time for questions, but thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was a little off script, but I hope that was fruitful for you. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to tell you that last statement is super powerful. I love that. That is something that you guys have on our It's great. Do you have an example?
What's that? Oh, she was just giving me a compliment, so it was good.
What is the most meaningful gift that you would talk about giving?
Meaningful gift we've ever given? That's a good question. I think I'll reword that to the one that I'm the most proud of. What is the gift that Robyn and I have given that I'm the most proud of? I would say it was you referred to it a major gift to build a new church at our parish. Close to home, all the things I talked about before. It's our responsibility. Somebody's got to step up to give some major gifts. It wasn't a cornerstone gift or anything like that. This was almost 20 years ago. So our earning, our capacity at the time, if you will, was not as high as it is now. But it was a truly sacrificial gift, and we stepped into a role, and we were among a group of families that made that happen. So for context, this was a 50-year-old parish in Oklahoma City, not a wealthy parish, and we're still there. It's not a wealthy parish, but they had built the temporary parish hall to be the church that was going to be the parish hall 30 years before, and they never got past it. So it was and considered to be not a very more of a blue collar parish. There are some folks that have capacity there. I'm looking at Sharia because that's where we met. She was with CCS as a consultant when we met. She was helping us with the campaign, and it was a stretch to get at the time it was a $7 million church built almost 20 years ago, and it was a stretch, but we got it done, and we had to economize and do all of that. But I'm very proud of that. That is and I was on the design committee, so there's a plaque in there with my name on it. So that is a generational impact that we were able to make by making a sacrificial gift, and that's the one I'm the most proud of for that reason. I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer that. I'll just characterize them. There have been some go away gifts that, hey, okay, fine. I like you. Here's a little money. But that's not something that's really rewarding. It might have been in the moment, but that's a flash in the pan. That comes and goes. Lady down front had a question, and then I'll come back to you, Sharia.
I just wondered if you can share an example of an organization who did a great job of moving you along the trajectory, taking your giving from that transactional to this more investor and ownership mentality.
I think I'm gonna. Peter gets a lot of accolades, but I'm gonna throw him a bone here anyway. Getting to know Peter and having conversations with Peter that have led to the sorts of comments that I'm making today. A lot of this, it hasn't necessarily been. Peter didn't teach me all this stuff. I don't want to say that. But Peter challenged me to think about and articulate, well, why do you, some of the questions John was asking. Why do you give? What's important to you? What makes something important? Hey, or just a comment, hey, Chuck, you should really concentrate on a few things if you want to have impact. You shouldn't you shouldn't just give to everybody who asks you. Identify what are your giving priorities. Local Catholic organizations and Catholic education specifically. That's kind of our A and B priorities right there. But being able to articulate that and explain that has forced me to think about giving in a different way. And so these questions, the golden questions, whatever they are, that's good because it helps form your donor to clarify their own thinking and really think about giving Not just reflexively giving, but thinking about how do I make an impact? What impact do I want to make? What are the areas that are most important to me? There again, you each have a role in helping your donors form themselves in that way by asking them questions and expecting an answer, expecting that they know what that answer is. That helps people move and grow in its own way. Down here, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that question is, do you and your friends find when a new philanthropy officer reaches that, do you find it annoying or like, wow, a new opportunity? And why do you find it annoying when you do? And why do you find it exciting when you find it?
Well, that's a good. So the question was, if you couldn't hear it, when a new development officer reaches out to me, do I find it annoying or exciting, and why? What I do find annoying is direct mail. I get almost as much junk mail in my physical mailbox as I do in my email box. So I find that annoying if that's the outreach. I will open and read a handwritten note. I do not open every piece of mail that hits my mailbox because I just like I delete emails before I read them if I can see that it's a waste of my time. So that's annoying at the far end of the spectrum. But there are in-person conversations that can be just as annoying. If it's to illustrate on the opposite side of the spectrum, I love hearing about what different ministries and apostolates are doing. I think it's great seeing all the exciting things going on in Catholic world. Peter mentioned my affiliation to the Napa Institute. That's why I like going to the summer conference. I love sitting down with a stranger and just talking about what work are you doing? What's your role in the church right now? What are you trying to build? What are you trying to grow? That's very energizing to me to hear about all the cool stuff going on, even if it doesn't, necessarily, trigger a response that's something I want to get involved in. I love just hearing about it. Again, if there's not that nice level of a connection, I don't know that that's going to lead to a gift, but I think there's a lot of cool things going on in the American Catholic Church, and I love hearing about all of it. So telling me about, the cool people you're working with and the cool things you're doing and the cool idea that got it all started, those are energizing conversations. If it's moving, but get to know me first, get to know everything John said. I like to listen more than I like to talk about myself. So that, there is some talking that development officer needs to do, but let's not rush right into what is it going to take to get a gift. Tell me about what you're doing. Get to know me. I say I don't like talking, but you ask me about my kids and my grandkid, I'm gonna talk your ear off. And as John illustrated, you're going to learn a lot about me and what's important to me through that conversation. So those are good initial interactions. Bad initial interactions are, here's our not even a proposal, even just here's our here's our materials. We hope you like us. There's nothing energizing about that. I'm sorry, Peter. Did you have something else? Okay. Good. Thank you.